Um, Give me the big picture. What are the kinds of arguments on both sides that you think are the primary ones that are legitimately used to either convince you that there is a God or that there is no God?
But for me, the most powerful argument for God's existence is the same one that I think has been the most powerful argument since people began to think about this, which is a first cause argument. But when I say that, I want to be careful about what I'm saying. A lot of people misunderstand the best versions of first cause arguments, which I think are put forward by someone like Thomas.Aquinas, based on the metaphysics of Aristotle.
So there's this video on YouTube by a theologian, philosopher guy named Thomas.Apologia. At least that's the kind of channel he's representing. And he criticizes Thomas's First Way like this.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another Thomas.Apologia video. And in today's video, I'm not going to be attempting to completely destroy, refute, and end all of these conversations, but rather my goal here is to give you guys my thoughts on why I personally find these arguments unconvincing, and also try to advance the conversation. Maybe someone might find a good response to what I have to say here, and we can advance the dialogue that way. I'd like to first of all start with the philosophical arguments in favour of classical theism and against neoclassical theism, and then we will move on to the scriptural arguments. So without further ado, let's get into our first argument that we will be analysing.
So in spirit of trying to move the conversation forward, this video addresses his criticisms in detail. Enjoy.
Okay, so the first argument that we're going to be analysing is the infamous First Way of St. Thomas Aquinas. So this argument basically argues that all things that were previously potential but are now actual require an extrinsic cause. But this chain of causes can't go on infinitely, so there must be a first cause of all things, which is pure actuality itself. So, in response to this,
Aquinas' first way, motion, derivative actuality, and the cumulative ascent to the first principle. Aquinas' first way is best read as Aristotle's argument for motion reconstructed inside a later metaphysical world. Aristotle supplies the immediate grammar: motion, actuality and potentiality, mover and moved, causal priority, and an unmoved principle. But Aquinas inherits this framework after Avicenna, Maimonides, and the wider Arabic, Jewish, and Christian traditions had sharpened the distinction between explaining motion and explaining being. Joseph Owens stresses both Aquinas' continuity with Aristotle and the danger of identifying their projects, while David Burrell places Aquinas within this broader conversation. Contemporary scholarship likewise emphasizes that the first way does not, by itself, establish everything Aquinas later means by God and subsistent being itself. Aquinas' procedure is cumulative: first change, then derivative causal power, and only afterward the question of what something absolutely first must be. The first way begins from the fact that some things change. Aquinas analyzes change through act and potency. Wood that can become hot is potentially hot. Fire that is hot can actualize that potency. His principle is that nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something actual. The point is not that every moving object needs another object physically pushing it. What is merely potential with respect to some actuality cannot, precisely as merely potential, already be the sufficient actual source of that same actuality. This is why self-motion is not an immediate refutation. A living thing can move itself if one actual principle, part, power, or operation actualizes another potency. David Oderberg defends the mover principle at this metaphysical level, while Daniel Shields argues that Aquinas need not require continuous physical contact between mover and moved. Peter Weigel likewise treats the mover premise as requiring careful defense. Newtonian inertia overturns the claim that uniform motion requires a continuously impressed force, but not the broader thesis that actualization requires an actual ground. Shields' later work develops this distinction in relation to modern science.
Thomas.Apologia's argument that the mover principle is basically an outdated push mechanics, at least as a claim, is addressed here. Aquinas' point is not that every moving thing needs something continuously pushing it, but that what is merely potential cannot, precisely as potential, supply the actuality it lacks.
A deeper objection asks why change should be analyzed through act and potency at all. Why not say only that a thing is not F at one time and is F at another?
Yeah, so the first way is really just concerned with change. That's the phenomenon that's trying to be explained.
Right. There is a modal aspect to this that, to be fair, Aquinas doesn't make explicit, which is, I think, that if something could change, then it could be in time, and anything that could be in time is in time. In other words, being in time or being outside of time, those are necessary properties of things. It's not just a contingent thing that you're in time or outside of time.
Yeah.
And once you have that, when you get to an unmoved mover, you realize, well, okay, the real question is, could this thing move? If it could, then it could be something that actually has a cause of change, which would make it dependent. But it can't be like that. It would have to then be in time already. But the point of the argument is it is not in time. And so what we argue, therefore, is it has to be not just unchanged, but unchangeable and totally outside time altogether. And I think that becomes absolutely vital. The first way is put first for a reason. He says it's the first and most obvious way. I don't know about the obvious.
Damn, anyway.
Yeah, but it is the most crucial. It's the one that is constantly referred to later when he's proving the other properties of God. So I think in his view, once you've got the first way, you've already got a God that is outside of time. And that turns out to be vital to almost everything else that follows. So that becomes the hidden background premise of all the other arguments to come. If you look at these all independently, you're going to miss that, and some of them will be missing an obvious, assumption. But he thinks he's already established it at the end of the first way, and he keeps using that again and again.
Change involves potentiality and actuality. So if something changes when some potentiality is actualized. So something that's unchangeable is a being that has no potentiality whatsoever. It's pure actuality, as Aristotle puts it. And that gives you a transcendent God in a certain very technical sense. It's very important.
Yes.
The Thomistic answer is that this records two states, but does not explain the subject's determinate capacities. Wood is not merely not hot. It is capable of becoming hot. Act and potency are intended to capture the modal structure of what a thing can become. Arrival theory may appeal instead to laws, dispositions, counterfactuals, primitive powers, or possible worlds. Then the dispute becomes comparative metaphysics.
Thomas.Apologia's argument that change can simply be described as something being not F and then F is basically addressed here. That gives you two states, but not yet an account of of what would be called the determinate capacity by which this thing could become F at all. Act and potency are meant to explain that modal structure.
The same applies to parsimony. Potency is not a second population of entities, but a capacity of an actual subject. The critic must show not merely that potency adds structure, but that the structure is dispensable.
Oh, again, Thomas.Apologia's parsimony objection is basically addressed here. Potency is not a second population of strange entities added to reality, but the capacity of an actual subject. So the critic, like Thomas.Apologia's YouTube channel, still has to show that this structure is genuinely dispensable rather than merely redescribed in different terms.
Is dispensable.
Oppie's critique is that, well, look, that's not how existence works. The way existence works is that things have existence, and they just go on having existence unless some cause comes along to stop them having existence. In other words, we don't invoke a cause for a thing having existence at any point that it has. It's not a participated source of existence. Rather, we evoke a cause whenever a thing ceases to have existence. So something's granted existence, it possesses existence, and then it only ceases to exist when something knocks it out of existence. Now, the problem with that as an attack on Aquinas is that it fundamentally diverges from the metaphysical buttressing of Aquinas' first way. The metaphysical buttressing of Aquinas' first way is that potency is actualized. Actuality is not potentialized. Actuality doesn't subsist in the potency. The potency is actualized by the source of actuality. So it's not the case that the actuality comes down and sits in the potency and just stays there until knocked out of the potency. It's that the potency is drawn into actuality by the source of actuality. So this idea of existential inertia just doesn't make sense on Aquinas' metaphysics. Now, Oppie is free to reject that metaphysics, but then he has to do the hard work of being a metaphysician and engaging with that. And Oppie just doesn't do that. And that's not Oppie's modus operandi in philosophy, because he doesn't think that metaphysical reasoning and argumentation is the way to go in philosophy. Because for him, philosophical engagement is one of comparing two positions and asking whose grass is greener, whose does more with less. It's just worldview comparison. It's not the traditional task of philosophy of forming arguments, making deductions, inferences, and coming to conclusions. It's really just comparing two things and asking which is better. Well, that is not at all what Thomas is doing. Thomas is putting forth the metaphysics, making deductions, inferences, and seeing where they go. Given Oppie's MO in philosophy, he is unable to evaluate Aquinas' metaphysics because he just doesn't do that sort of metaphysical reasoning. Now, Oppie asks us to consider, as an example of existential inertia, he says, take some color property. When we color a chair red, the chair doesn't remain red because it's continually dependent on a source of redness, say the one who dyes it. It remains red until somebody comes along and dyes it green. Well. Anybody who has read Aquinas' Principles of Nature or philosophy of nature in general will tell you that the chair does remain red because it does depend on a continual source of redness, not the efficient cause of red, but on the formal cause of red, i.e. that the chair is constituted in such a way that it looks red. That's the formal cause of the redness, the chair being formed in that way that it be red. The chair depends on that formal cause, not the efficient cause which introduces the form, but certainly the formal cause. Not only that, existence is not like a color property. The reason why the color property remains or subsists or persists in the chair is because the chair subsists. The reason why existence remains in the thing is not because the thing persists, because the thing persists only because it has existence. So the persistence of existence is not because the thing will exist, but because there's some source of existence which grants existence to the thing and allows the thing to persist at any point at which it does persist. Okay, so existence plays a different causal role in the constitution of things than does color properties. And all of that is to say, when we go back to the first way, for Thomas, it's not actuality which is potentialized, brought down into the potency and just subsists there in the potency like the color property in the chair. It's potency which is actualized, like something being illuminated by the light of the sun and depending on the light of the sun for its illumination for at any point that it's illuminated. So Oppie's objection, if it's an objection to Aquinas' first way, which it isn't, it's an objection to Feezer, but if it should be construed as an objection to Aquinas' first way, misses the mark entirely.
Yeah.
The next step is more difficult. Suppose fire actualizes wood. Why proceed farther? Perhaps the fire's causal power is primitive. Aquinas' argument becomes stronger when stated conditionally. If an actualizer possesses the relevant causal actuality non-derivatively, that inquiry stops. If it possesses that power only derivatively, the inquiry continues to whatever grounds its efficacy. Aquinas' distinction between per se and accidentally ordered causes is decisive. A grandfather need not remain causally active for his grandson to generate a child. By contrast, a stick moves a stone instrumentally through the hand. The issue is not merely earlier and later, but dependence in the exercise of causal power. Caleb Coho argues that the derivative character of an essentially ordered series is the reason it requires a first and independent member. Aquinas therefore need not deny every infinite causal succession. The real question is whether a hierarchy can be wholly derivative. If A acts only through B only through C, and so indefinitely, what ultimately accounts for the actuality being exercised? The Thomistic claim is that derivative possession does not explain itself merely by being multiplied.
The reason is that the causal chain is essential, not accidental in nature. Think about a chain of dominoes. You could destroy all the previous dominoes that fell, and this would not stop future dominoes from falling. It's an accidentally ordered series. But an essentially ordered series is like a bunch of gears. If you take out any gear in the series, the entire series stops spinning. If the series were infinitely long, but every gear can only be turned by a previous gear, then none of them will turn, which is similar to the train example I gave earlier. The impossibility of an infinitely long, essentially ordered series is explained by Garrigou-Lagrange, who said, "To do away with a supreme cause is to claim that, as someone has said, a brush will paint by itself, provided it has a very long handle."
This is the deepest internal challenge. A critic can reject metaphysical well-foundedness and maintain that every derivative member is explained by another without any non-derivative foundation. The dispute is then between metaphysical foundationalism and non-well-founded dependence.
Thomas.Apologia's argument that an essentially ordered causal series could just regress indefinitely is basically addressed here. Endlessly multiplying derivative causal powers does not explain the actuality every member possesses only derivatively. So him and his criticism has to defend the stronger claim that a wholly derivative hierarchy can itself be metaphysically ultimate, which he doesn't do.
At this point, the local conclusion must remain modest. The argument reaches a mover whose relevant causal actuality is not derivative within the order under analysis. It does not yet follow that one numerically identical mover terminates every possible causal order, nor that this mover is incapable of every kind of change. Daniel Shields emphasizes this point. Aquinas himself makes the same distinction in Summa Contra Gentiles, where he warns that reaching a mover not moved by an exterior mover does not yet establish that it is absolutely unmoved. This matters for the gap problem. Schmid and Linford press the question of why locally first movers must become one universal first. Aquinas gives further arguments for divine unity later. Likewise, the move to pure act requires additional metaphysics.
Thomas.Apologia's argument that the first way only gets a local first actualizer rather than one universal first cause is basically addressed here, and he's off, right? Because Aquinas agrees that the first way alone does not yet get you something like that, but if there were several absolutely ultimate first causes, there would have to be some basis for their difference, and whatever explains that difference threatens their ultimacy.
In his treatment of simplicity, Aquinas argues that composition introduces dependence and that the absolutely first principle cannot be posterior to constituent principles. Only after passive potency has been excluded does absolute immutability follow. Whatever changes is in some way in potency, and only after immutability is established does eternity follow, because eternity belongs to what lacks intrinsic succession.
Thomas.Apologia's argument that a first actualizer could still change in some other respect is definitely addressed here. Aquinas himself recognizes that merely reaching something not moved by another does not yet establish pure actuality, but if the ultimate cause could still be actualized in some respect, then whatever accounts for that actuality would be more fundamental in that. Thomas.Apologia's argument that passive potency need not imply imperfection is basically addressed here. Aquinas' deeper point is not simply that change would make God better or worse, but that passive potency means receptivity to an actuality not yet possessed, which introduces explanatory dependence unless the critic, like Thomas.Apologia's YouTube channel does, can explain how such receptivity requires nothing prior to it, which obviously he's not going to do.
Suppose we grant that we have some purely actual thing or something which is purely actual. How do we get from there to making certain attributions to it of other properties, say of omniscience, mentality, and so forth?
Yeah, cool. So this is awesome stuff. You have pure existence itself, pure actuality, right? And so what Thomas does when he usually deduces the the different divine attributes is that he points out that we don't have any sort of direct insight into God's essence itself. That's the whole incomprehensibility of God's essence. We can apprehend something about God's essence and all the rest, even if we were right in front of God's essence, but we have no direct insight into it. So what do we do then? We deduce from what we do know about God as primary cause, pure existence itself, what it is like to be pure existence itself. In other words, what follows from that. So if you have pure existence itself, what would that be like? Okay, how could you characterize that? That's what the different divine attributes signify. What Thomas does, it's the classic philosopher's distinction, is he distinguishes between the sense and the reference of the attributes that he's about to put across. So you have these different sort of divine attributes, all distinct in sense, so distinct sort of conceptual contents by which we can understand them, but identical references. If any of your listeners are unaware of the distinction between sense and reference, sorry, I don't know what the makeup of your listeners are, so I really hope I'm not patronizing or anything like that. The basic example of distinction of sense and reference is the morning star and the evening star. So the morning star is the isn't it? It's the last star you see in the morning, and the evening star is the first star you see in the evening. In reality, that's one and the same thing, which is planet Venus. Or another example I like to use with the students is the breakfast table and the dinner table. So different sort of senses, but they refer to one and the same table, unless you're lucky enough to have two tables for breakfast and dinner. That's the distinction in sense, identity and reference. And Thomas then, with that in place, then he just asks, well, look, what would it be like to be pure existence itself? And the first thing he argues for, would you like me to go through some of the attributes?
Sure, yeah, if that's all right.
Yeah, not a problem. So the first thing he argues for is the utter simplicity of pure existence itself. And the reason why he argues for the utter simplicity of pure existence itself is what it comes down to is that there is no potency within it, or there's nothing in it to which it stands in potency, because it is pure existence itself. In other words, it simply is what it is to be. And since, existence is the act of all acts, that's without which there is no actuality, since it is just that, then there is nothing in it which stands in potency to be actualized, and there's nothing extrinsic to it to which it stands in potency. So everything then stands in potency to it stands in potency to nothing, and since it is just the act of all acts as pure existence, there is no potency then within it, and so it can't be composed in any sort of way, because a basic condition of composition is some sort of potency which is actualized in some respect. So he infers then that in virtue of being pure existence, it must be utterly simple. Should we go on from that?
This cumulative structure explains why the first way does not require a first moment of time. Aquinas explicitly denies that philosophy can demonstrate a temporal beginning of the universe. First means explanatory or ontological first, not earliest. The same distinction governs creation. Creation is not the first physical motion, but the dependence of the whole creature upon the cause of its being. Gavin Kerr emphasizes this radical dependence in Aquinas' doctrine of creation. The beginningless universe could therefore still be created if its being were wholly from another. The hand-stick stone example must not do too much work. It illustrates derivative causal power. It does not prove that every finite cause is related to God exactly as a stick is related to a hand. Contemporary reconstructions divide here. Fieser develops a stronger Aristotelian argument toward a purely actual actualizer. McNabb and DeVito defend reconstructed versions against Graham Oppie, and McNabb later responds to Schmid and Linford. Oppie argues that naturalists have independent reasons for resisting some of the metaphysical premises. The real disagreement is therefore over rival accounts of modality, powers, dependence, and ultimate explanation. Questions about time belong downstream. Robert Kuhn's dynamic B theory shows at minimum that Aristotelian powers metaphysics does not simply entail presentism. Problems about changing divine knowledge arise most sharply only after immutability and eternity are in view.
Thomas.Apologia's time theory objection is a nice, modern one that I don't think Aquinas really gets at directly, because it's a modern kind of framing of things, but there's plenty of machinery there to address it, and it's basically answered enough here at this point to show that it's not a refutation of the first way anyways, right? Act and potency do not simply entail A theory or B theories, at least not automatically eliminate what's important here, which is genuine actualization. And even if A theory created a problem for immutable divine knowledge, that would be a downstream problem for divine immutability, not a refutation of the first way's conclusion. So it's just a little bit of a non sequitur.
Historically, the first way remains Aristotelian because its explanandum is motion. Aristotle's physics and metaphysics supply the grammar of act, potency, motion, and unmoved causality. Olga Lizany's treatment of Avicenna helps clarify the distinction between the prime mover of physics and the absolute first principle of metaphysics, a distinction grounded in Avicenna's own metaphysics. Gavin Kerr's work on De Ente et Essentia shows that Aquinas also possesses a distinct existential root, grounded in Aquinas' own on being and essence, while John Whipple traces how these lines converge within Aquinas' wider metaphysics. Anthony Kenny's classic critique and the forthcoming project of Robert Kuhn's and Daniel Bohnbach show how philosophically lived these questions remain. The strongest reconstruction is neither triumphalist nor dismissive. Real change calls for an account of determinate capacity and actuality. Potency, precisely as potency, does not supply the actuality it lacks. Where causal actuality is derivative, explanatory dependence continues. The central question is whether wholly derivative actuality can be metaphysically ultimate. If the Thomist is right that it cannot, the first way reaches a non-derivative terminus of the relevant causal order. The first way does not prove God in 5 sentences, nor is it destroyed by Newtonian mechanics. Its deepest challenge is whether derivative actuality and derivative causal power can be ultimate without anything non-derivative at all. Aquinas' answer is no. The critic who answers yes has not merely rejected a medieval physics. The critic has adopted a rival metaphysics of dependence.